Got it right. In this series of 6 lectures on topic of religious experience entitled Narrative and Analysis. So the whole idea of it is to be telling people stories, well-known stories, and then to be analyzing those in order to understand something better about religious experience and be able to help ourselves to understand something more. These lectures are all autonomous units. They stand on their own merits, and you can come to one or the other. But those who come to them regularly, I think, should end up getting sort of a general picture of what religious experience is all about. By the end of it, we ought to be able to pull together a lot of different ideas, and we will have seen at least 6 different general types of religious experience, including the one that we try to look at, the Eastern slant to it, and talking about the boundary experience. Next week we'll be talking about the mystical experience, and tonight it is the conversion experience. And I think that, every now and then it seems like a particular one will click in. I got a very nice note from somebody during the week saying that some of the personal things that I shared about my reactions were helpful to them, and that's always nice to know. I don't imagine that just everything that's said is of complete interest to everybody, but I'm always hoping that one or the other ideas will produce some sort of personal reflection or help some people here understand their own life in a little greater depth. The experiences of God, or the depth dimension of life, do vary according to history and culture, and that's an important thing to remember in the light of the 2 things we're going to do tonight and next week, since we're dealing with people who are removed from us in both culture and in history. And I think that colors the kind of experience they had, and yet I believe that there really is sort of a universal tinge to all of that. Tonight, too, I'm thinking that I'm probably going to be lecturing longer, and therefore I would like to take a break before I end up doing the whole thing. In other words, I want to split the material in half and take a break somewhere along the line and then come back and complete it, because I will be talking, I think, a little bit longer time this evening. And I'm feeling sort of free to do that. Obviously, people can leave at the break if they want to or need to. And I just have the sense of trying to make sure that people are with the program here, and I might try to do that in various ways. I have to feel my way with that. We'll see. Now, the topic tonight is the conversion experience, and there's a couple reasons why that ought to be important to us, I think. One is that there's all kind of people walking around today talking about their conversion experiences, and they do it under the heading of the born-again experience. I suppose almost everyone has encountered somebody like that, or heard about it, or read about it, or has gone through the experience themselves. The born-again experience, the turning around of one's life, handing one's life over to the Lord, particular day and time, one has been baptized by the Spirit, begun a new life, and so on. That has become a really common kind of phenomenon in our culture, and one way of analyzing it is in terms of the conversion experience. And I think the other reason that the topic is important is because everybody who comes to a lecture like this is really interested in personal growth. Somehow or another, we're striving to become better people or develop our potential, do better with our talents, grow as individuals, become better Christians, more responsive to the Spirit. Whatever our language, I think everybody is involved somewhat in that process. And the word conversion, again, is a good way of getting at all of that. The conversion experience is a way of thinking about our growth in life, in which we sort of are historical creatures, and the important moments come forward for us, and we need to be attuned to those and know what they are all about. So for at least those 2 reasons, I think the topic ought to be important to us, of this whole idea is the conversion experience. Now, at the beginning, I will want to remind us of some of the general understandings of human nature that I have, assumptions borrowed from other theologians and so on, but that are crucial to an understanding of our topic. In other words, an anthropology, of understanding of what we humans are like and what makes us tick. The first characteristic is that we are self-transcendent creatures. And what I mean by that is that we're not satisfied with where we're at in life generally. Now and then I meet people who are, but something usually will come up that says, hey, I've got to move beyond this. So that someone experiences the particular thing in life, they go to Europe and they have a good time and they get back home and somebody says, but did you see this? And they say no, and then they want to go back again. In other words, we're always transcending the amount of experience we have. You can do that analysis in terms of love as well. We know so much love in our lives. We give so much and receive so much. And I think there's sort of a constant sense that one would like to multiply and intensify that in one's life so that love would become deeper and more extensive for us. Also true in terms of our knowledge. We're always striving to know more things in life. And therefore, I think that what we must keep in mind in this conversion experience is this whole idea of self-transcendence, this idea that we are always moving beyond where we are at any given moment, intentionally, by where we'd like to be, by our dreams, our ideals. We always got some sort of a gap between what we'd like to be doing and how we'd like to be and how we actually behave. And the second thing is to see about ourselves is that we are multidimensional creatures. We exist and move and act in many levels of our being. So we have an affective life, an emotional life. We have feelings. We have an intellectual life. We know things. We reason, logic, and so on. We have an imaginative life, an imaginative dimension to our existence in which there's images that grab us and move us and shape us. We have a moral dimension to our lives in which we are trying to improve our conduct. And finally, we have a religious dimension to our lives in which we try to locate ourselves in some larger framework and figure out who we are and how we fit and how we're relating to our God and how our commitment to Jesus Christ is going. Now, all of those overlap and are intertwined and so on, and it's hard to just take the feelings out and set them aside. But I think we can see these various dimensions in ourselves. And the reason this is important is because that's how I want to structure my talk tonight, around those various dimensions of our life, so that it's possible to have an affective conversion and an intellectual conversion, moral conversion, and so on. And so we want to look at those and to try to see something about how we should grow and develop, and we're going to have Augustine be our guide in that whole process. Now, that brings up this notion that having a guide is helpful. It seems good to have somebody around flesh and blood you can look at and say, well, there's how they grew and developed. That's how they responded to life. And so we got people in the Bible like that. Conversion experiences are familiar in the Bible. Abraham leaves his known familiar land and goes to another land in response to the call of God. Paul, a persecutor of the church, is struck by this strong experience. His whole life is turned around, and he moves from being persecutor of the church to being a follower of Jesus Christ and the great missionary of the early church. We see in our own time, skipping over all the centuries and major conversion experiences, our own day, people we've taken in here. Thomas Merton, life turned around. You know, he's living a wild life of New York City and so on, and suddenly there comes this time in his life when he just redirects it, reorients himself entirely. Conversion experience. We saw it with Dorothy Day. So Dorothy Day at one point sees her life as a choice between God and the man she's living with, and makes a decision to break up that relationship and to move her whole life in response to the call of God. Those are conversion experiences, and What is it that they have in common? I mean, when you look at all that, what are we talking about in these conversion experiences? Well, they are a turning around of one's life. Conversio means a turning, complete, doing 180, as they say today, in response to the call of God. So we find in the Hebrew Scriptures that it's a real turn from living a life of injustice to living a life in which one is trying to spread justice and to be a just kind of person. We see Jesus calling people away from selfishness to being proclaimers of the kingdom. We see Paul saying that you got to leave aside the flesh, the selfishness of life, and turn to the Spirit in which one is responsive now to the call of God. We see John talking about the same thing in his gospel, his writings, in terms of darkness and light. It's to move out of the darkness, do this 180, and get into the light. So in the Scriptures, you see this general notion of conversion, what we're talking about here. It involves a repentance, a turning away from sin, and it involves faith, that is, responding to the call of Almighty God, committing oneself to the Lord. Now, there's people in the modern world who have tried to analyze this as well. I just tell you a few examples of this. William James, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, a book I've referred to a lot in this series, thought that conversion involved getting a new center of energy inside of oneself, a new hot spot, so to speak, a new center of gravity that would move one from being an unhappy and disorganized and dispirited and unintegrated person to become now, with a new center of energy and strength, now to be a happy and peaceful person, an integrated person, a person living a constructive life. He thought that that was prepared for in our unconscious, and that the time came when we would make that kind of response to God. There's other thinkers, without going into their names or doing a lot of detail on this. I might give credit to Bernard Lonergan, who is behind a lot of what I'm saying now. And say, if people want seats, I'm sure there's a lot of seats if you'd like to sit down. Some people will move in from the side there and make sure you have a place to sit. So that Bernard Lonergan talks about conversion in terms of a decision to follow a call of the Lord, which creates for us a whole different structure, which gives us a new horizon or a new frame of reference within which we're going to act and live. This would be another way of speaking about what the conversion experience is all about. So, maybe that's a little bit of background now to see what we're talking about. Everyone ought to have a feel for that. It's part of the developmental process in life of getting ourselves together and making progress moving forward. And the suggestion is that we can probably see a rhythm to this. There's probably moments when it catches us, and when we rise to the occasion, and when we do make some progress. Even if we don't do a 180, maybe in our life we find times when we do something less than that, but we do reorient ourselves a little bit to the one that we call our God. Now I want to talk a bit about St. Augustine, who will be our guide through these various types of conversion experience. First, to remind you of the great importance of Augustine. He is a towering kind of figure. He died in 430, just to locate him a little bit before I give the history. But he is, you could argue, the most influential Christian theologian there's ever been. He shaped the whole of the Western history, as a matter of fact. He's been constantly used for people in every age to understand what it meant to be a Christian. Someone had once said that all of theology is nothing but a footnote to Augustine. In other words, he shaped the questions. He's given the main answers for all this. We're dealing here with the giant in intellectual Western history, and especially in the whole area of theology. His most famous book is The Confessions, which many people have read and has influenced people's thinking. We think of the Protestant Reformation, when the Reformers are going back to where would they find their outlook, their general mode of approaching Christianity and so on. It was back to Augustine. He became great influence on them. Some of his phrases are still with us. What is evil? It's the privation of good. He's the one who said, love and do what you will. He who sings well prays twice. I really like that one. The one that you hear me use all of the time, that one should pray as though everything depends on God and work as though everything depends on you. One of the wisest statements I think ever made in the history of thought. And then the famous one beginning the Confessions, our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee. So it goes on like that. He's given us so much of our language and things that we just continue to hang on to. Now I'll run through his life quickly just to locate you again. He's born in northern Africa in the year 354. In all likelihood he would have been a light-skinned individual. His mother was named Monica. I'm going to talk a lot about her throughout the lecture. She was a devout Christian woman. She was married to Patricius, Augustine's father, who was a pagan. Augustine was not baptized when he was little. He was quite a rebellious youth. At the age of 11, he got the chance to go away to school, and I think was very happy to do that. When he was 16, the family ran out of money, and they didn't get the financial support, and he had to return home, and that caused no ends of problems. One whole book of the Confessions is directed to the 16th year, which was a stormy one to say the least. A lot of troubles with his mother and so on. Then at the age of 17, he can only take that for 1 year at home like that, and got out again to go to Carthage, a city in northern Africa, and it was there that he began to exercise some of his freedom that he wanted. He started living with a young woman who was nameless. So he gives all the names of everybody else, but we never find out who she is. And he continued to live with her for 15 years, as a matter of fact. He had a son by her whose name was Adeodatus, which means, interestingly enough, God-given. Then during his 20s, there was a lot of difficult time there. A good friend of his died that just threw him into a terrible depression. He was a teacher of rhetoric, and he didn't like it. His students didn't pay attention, and they fell asleep and weren't serious and so on. And therefore, he didn't like that at all. His relationships with his family weren't good. One time he went home, his mother wouldn't let him in. And he took up at this time the Manichaean faith. He became an auditor or a hearer in the Manichaean religion, which was founded by a fellow by the name of Mani, and taught a tremendous dualism about life, that there was a good God and a bad God, and that's what accounted for the good and evil in our world, and so on. And he was in that from the ages of 18 to 27. Then in the year 376, he opened up a school at Carthage. He moved. He thought that he would have his own school and run things that would be better. That didn't go too well. At the age of 30, he went to Milan and met there St. Ambrose, a very influential figure in his life, became a catechumen in the church, and then at the age of around 32 or so, happened is the conversion experience that people always talk about. I will give you that in great detail. And so 1 year later, at the Easter Vigil, he was with the other catechumens. He was baptized, 387. His mother was extremely happy with all of that. It was a glorious time for them. They went off to a retreat kind of setting. He had some marvelous experiences with his mother, and then shortly after that, she died. Again, I'll talk a lot about that. And then he went back and he wanted to live a life of just quiet reflection, and found a monastery and lived with a group of friends and so on. Everything would be lovely. And then when he's back in his hometown in North Africa, and he'd be careful wherever he traveled, because if he went there, he's afraid they'd try to make him a priest. And that's how they did in those days. If they got somebody they really liked, they might not only make him a priest, but a bishop. So he'd only travel to cities where there was already a bishop. He wouldn't leave. He's afraid they're going to grab him up. And so one time he made the mistake of going to Hippo, where there was a bishop, but he was looking for a helper. And unfortunately, the people grabbed him there at a church service and pushed him forward and made him a priest. And that was in 391, and 4 years later, they insisted on him becoming a bishop. And then it was in his middle 40s, during his own midlife crisis. Oh, I don't know if that's true, but that he wrote the Confessions in his middle years. 43 to 47 is when he wrote that. Then he spent the rest of the time fighting people, various heretical groups, the Donatists and the Pelagians and so on. Then he wrote his great work, The City of God. That was a response to the fall of Rome in 410, sack of Rome by Alaric. And Augustine wrote that great work in response to that. Late in his life, then he wrote his Retractions, which is probably a good idea for anyone who writes. You know, sometimes sit down and say all the mistakes you made, all the things you want to retract. And then 3 years later, in the year 430, on August 28th, he died right while his city was being besieged by the barbarians, by the Vandals. So that is his career, and after that his ideas were picked up, used throughout the Western world, and so on. And as I say, an enormously influential figure. Well, that just gives you a little feel for it. So born 354, you know, sort of a wild life. Then he converts and changes, and then trying to live the quiet life, but he can't do it. They force him into becoming a priest, and then even into a bishop. He writes all these books and so on, and thereby influences our own time and history. Now, I want to look at these various aspects of our own lives in relationship to Augustine and let him take a tour through those for us. And the invitation, of course, is to say, where in my own life do I need this kind of conversion? Where is it that I need to work on? So this is very much of a schema for a personal examination of conscience, very effective one, I think, of a systematic way of looking at my own life and saying, how am I doing, and where do I have to turn it around yet? Where do I have to make progress? So the first area I will take is the affective domain, whole area of feeling, of emotion, so on. Well, I'm going to look at Augustine's relationship with Monica here in order to try to see something about his own emotional life. It's been said that the Confessions really is a whole book of emotion. It's a book of the heart. He pours his spirit out. There's probably been no one in history who's really been so self-critical, so deep in understanding their own emotions and what's going on inside their heart. It is a magnificent thing to read a man just probing his own soul, just relentlessly and deeply and searingly looking within, almost more than most of us could ever imagine trying or taking. It would be just too much, probably destroy us if we tried to do it to the kind of degree that he did. So we look at his relationship with his mother. He remembers her really as quite a domineering and sort of hovering kind of mother. She was always sort of on top of him, wanting him to do things and to shape up. In the worst way, she wanted him to be a success in life and to be a Christian. She couldn't get him baptized when he was little. Probably his father didn't want it, but that's what she longed for him to really be converted. He wanted desperately to get away from her because she was, I think, so relentless and domineering in many ways. And then when he was back at the age of 11, as I said, he did get away and was on his own and so on. And then came back when he was 16, and he talks about the enormous anxiety that his mother gave him over the whole area of sexuality. He's very big on that area and him being careful, and gave him all kind of restrictions in relationship to women and so on. And this seemed to have sort of a bad effect on him generally. After that, as you know, the whole sexual area, well, we'll deal with that when in the moral side, a major kind of difficulty for Augustine. Then he does, at the age of 17, he leaves again, goes off to Carthage, which is sort of the big city, and try to establish his freedom again. I'm periodically going to read you some quotes here to give you a feel for what his emotional life and the way he wrote. It's sort of there that he got into his adolescent crisis and so on. And he writes this way about that period. 17, he's going off to Carthage now. I was not yet in love, but I was in love with love. And from the depths of my need, I hated myself for not more keenly feeling the need. What I needed most was to love and to be loved. But most of all, when I obtained the enjoyment of the body of the person who loved me, I rushed headlong into love, eager to be caught. Happily, I wrapped those painful bonds around me, and sure enough, I would be lashed with the red-hot iron rods of jealousy, by suspicions and fear, by bursts of anger and quarrels. So we have a very honest portrayal of his own remembrance of how he was at that age of 17. You see that the various emotions there that he weaves into his portrayal. Then it was at the age of 21, after he was in Carthage and teaching there and so on, at the age of 21 he returned home to teach there, and Monica at that point wouldn't let him in the house, mostly because he had become a Manichaean during that period. And the Manichaeans were a hated heretical group. She was a staunch Catholic. She didn't brook any kind of opposition to her outlook on that, so she didn't let him in the house even, and that had to create a lot of conflict. But then she had a dream, and Monica was always ruled by dreams. That was sort of big in that African culture at that time, and I think Augustine respected those dreams, that she dreamed that one day he would be converted and would be all right. And at that point she said, well, I guess I can let him in the house now. All is well. It'll turn out okay. So she let him back in at that time. Then at the age of 28, after he was there for a while, he decided to go to Rome from Carthage in North Africa. And Monica tried to stop him and from going. She didn't want him to go to Rome, wanted him to stay in North Africa, be close to home, in other words. Couldn't stand to see him go so far away. And then I will read you a quote of what Augustine remembers about that particular experience. She was indeed in dreadful grief at my going, and followed me right to the coast. You had this picture, she's going right with him, up to the boat here, trying to talk him out of it. Then she clung to me, passionately determined that, he's 28 years old now, by the way, passionately determined that I should either go back to home with her or take her to Rome. But I deceived her with the pretense that I had a friend whom I did not want to leave until he had sailed off with a fair wind. Thus I lied to my mother, and such a mother. She would not return home without me, but I managed with some difficulty to persuade her to spend the night in a place near the ship where there was an oratory in memory of St. Cyprian. That night I stole away from her. She remained praying and weeping. The wind blew and filled our sails, and the shore dropped from our sight. She went home, and I to Rome. Well, he got to Rome, but he felt so guilty about this he could hardly function. In fact, he got very ill, and one might surmise that we were dealing with sort of a psychosomatic illness at this time. That year in Rome really was a terrible time for him. And as you see throughout his emotional life here, he so often suffered from guilt feelings. Very difficult thing. Yeah, and then to pick up with some of his emotional feelings here, what happened to him when he was in Rome and had a difficult time is he really lost his self-confidence. He didn't think he really could do much right at all, and he had to get out of there. Nothing was working right, and that is when he went to Milan. And that's where he met Ambrose. And he said one time that seldom was a person ever so open to any new ideas. Ambrose was the bishop of Milan, and a powerful preacher and so on. And his confidence was so broken in his own ideas and so on that he just felt like he was completely vulnerable and open to any kind of sort of powerful message, and Ambrose had it. Then it was that Monica came on the scene again after he got to Milan, and this time she was more active, and she decided that Augustine had to get married, and that he had to get married to a rich heiress, because that was probably the only way he was going to really make it in life. And she got Augustine to dismiss the woman he had been living with now for 15 years, and to send her back home. And Augustine took that very hard. He says, I'm quoting now, "This was a blow which crushed my heart to bleeding. I loved her dearly." Talking about the woman he had lived with. Well, the woman he had lived with was really of a lower socioeconomic class, and she couldn't do him any good. And Monica really, could see that he wasn't going to make any progress, and so the idea was to link him up with another woman who could support him as he did his sort of philosophical work. Then it was that well, there's a little bit more to that story there. I'll save it for the moral section. Then he finally, after Ambrose influences him and he becomes a catechumen, and then later on he has his conversion experience, then he decides to get baptized. And that really was a tremendous time for her. It was, I'll read something for you again here. This is Augustine thinking about his joys after his baptism and the time with his mother. She was so excited and happy, and they went off to a retreat kind of place. And he wrote this way, "The days were not long enough as I meditated and found wonderful delight in meditating upon the depth of your design." Forgot to tell you, the whole Confessions is written as a prayer to God. It's one long prayer. He keeps addressing God, so that's what he's doing here. Meditating upon the depth of your design for the salvation of the human race. I wept at the beauty of your hymns and canticles, and was powerfully moved at the sweet sound of your church's singing. Those sounds flowed into my ears, and the truth streamed into my heart, so that my feeling of devotion overflowed, and the tears ran from my eyes, and I was happy in them. In some sense of the joy that he and Monica were sharing at this particular time. And then there came a marvelous religious experience. One thing you notice about Augustine is that he's almost never alone, and a lot of his experiences happen with other people. And one of his greatest religious experiences happened with his mother, together, and she had a similar experience while they were meditating on the wisdom of God. And suddenly he says that just for a fleeting moment, he and his mother touched that wisdom. And they began then, they were moved deeply by this, and then they just began to talk about this experience, probably the great moment of their lives, deep conversation about their sense of the wisdom of God. And then it was within a couple weeks that she died, right after all of this. And she said things to him before he died. She said, "You were a good son. You really didn't hurt me." And she was proud of him. Very touching kind of thing. And then when Augustine, when she died, he repressed all of his grief. because he was ashamed to show those emotions in front of other people. And he was ashamed that those emotions had power over him. He didn't want to admit that. And then it was that he began to think back over some of the good moments with his mother and so on. And then the flood came, and he said, tears came, and he says, I found solace in weeping in your sight. Speaking to God, I found solace in weeping in your sight, both about her and for her. So as Augustine got to the point where his emotions were now sort of in sync with the rest of his being. Well, what do we see? That little portrayal there of his affective life. I think that one way of seeing it is that Augustine had learned to make his emotions work for him in a sense. He'd learned to transform them into a power. He learned to be able to communicate with God about the deepest feelings he had. I think it's very significant that he had to repress the grief at first, but then it was able to flow, and he found great solace and comfort in that. Now, what do we get out of this? Affective conversion seems to be something that's crucial for all of us. Important part of totally moving towards being a more integrated person. I can put it in terms to you of polarities. At one side of the unconverted person, affectively, is a person who doesn't know their emotions. They don't know what they're really feeling, not in touch with them, not able to really express them at all, not able to use them. They end up getting in a person's way. They end up getting repressed and causing further depression, or they end up being used against people instead of for one's own personal growth. I might point out Augustine didn't have this totally under control. Even later in his life, when he argued with St. Jerome, he was often bitter and biting and sarcastic, and his emotions ended up hurting the relationship. But on the one side, the unconverted person affectively simply is out of touch with all of that, can't use the emotions constructively. And so, on the other side of all of this, if one did get it together in a way, now the emotions would be unexperienced. One would feel them. They wouldn't be pushed down or repressed in any way. Then they would be understood. We'd know why we were angry, or why we were jealous, or how we mobilize our joy to do something good. Then we would accept the emotions. Say, that's me. That's just part of me. I was talking to someone recently about that. Just sort of came to that insight while we were talking, like, talking about sexual fantasies. And he said, well, I guess you're trying to tell me I just got to accept that they're part of me, part of who I am. That's the kind of acceptance that seems we need. That we're able to critique the emotions. That is, that we're able to say whether they are appropriate or not. Does the kind of anger I have in this situation make sense or not? Is it fitting, or is it overblown and needs to be somehow reined in or checked or seen through? And finally, that the emotions would be mobilized for our good, that we'd be able to take the strong emotions and have them be something that would move us to constructive action in life. Instead of being a block to being a good person, they would help us to function more effectively. So there we have what I might call an affective conversion. I've given it to you in two poles. The totally unconverted, not in touch, don't know them, can't face them, can't do anything with them. They're just, my head and heart are just always fighting. To do the 180, to convert, be on the other side now, I experience them, I understand them, I accept them, I critique them, and they are mobilized somehow for constructive action. Now, once we sort of see what that is, how we might look at that, then that might leave us with certain other questions that we might have in mind. We have to ask ourselves then, all right, what emotions am I not in touch with? Where do I need to find out how to critique them? Do I have emotions that are inappropriate? And that I get madder than I should over small things. I have to begin to see through that. Or to what degree is my head and my heart together? That's the kind of question, it would seem to me, that would flow from this kind of analysis. At this point, I'm trying to figure out what to do next. Those who followed my first comments realize that we've got 4 more like that to go, right? Intellectual, imaginative, moral, and religious. We have to figure out, what have we been going here? I think I'm inclined to maybe do one more and then take our break. I think that's what I want to do. Are people with me? All right, why not? Let's take up the intellectual domain. This I think perhaps is a little bit harder to follow, but I think is also important for understanding Augustine and needs to be part of our own conversion experience as well. Start out with the fact that Augustine was a bright young man, no doubt about it. Fortunately, he could have been imprisoned in that little village of his, little town, and spent his whole life there, never got out. The only way he could have got out is to have a wealthy patron, somebody who would pay for his education. And that happened, and he did break out, got the chance to be educated and so on. And the whole plan was for him to become a lawyer and to join the imperial service. By becoming a government official, government employee, that's the way one made it and broke out of the small town life as he knew it. And so he was being groomed for that. That was the whole effort and so on. Then, at the age of 19, he read Cicero's Hortensius, in which Cicero said, what you got to do in life is strive for wisdom. Wisdom that would help one to understand life as a whole. Wisdom that would be even bigger and better than knowledge. Wisdom that would tell us what the deepest answers to life are all about. And it was at that time that Augustine underwent his first intellectual conversion. He saw that just filled him with power. It just shot through his being, and he says he doesn't want to be a lawyer anymore. He doesn't want to go out. He wants to be a philosopher. He didn't know you couldn't get a job that way, He wanted to be a philosopher. He wanted to sit around and think about the great questions. That's the only thing that really interested him from that point. Now that sort of interest now moved him to say, all right, I got to find a way of understanding my life, and I need a system now. Just to want wisdom wasn't enough. He needed some system to fit into, to begin to thinking. That's when he returned to the Manichaeans. And that has a lot to do with his moral life and so on. I told you briefly what they were all about, but one thing is that they did try to deal with the great questions of life, like how do you account for evil in the world? And their great answer to the evil in the world was that there was a good God running things, but there was an evil principle as well, the God of darkness. And that God was fighting with the good God, and that conflict between those two principles were what affected the evil and that caused the evil in this world, caused the mix of good and evil. And so he stuck with that, thought all about it for a long time. He could never quite get the answers, and he kept waiting for this one guy to come, the big theologian of the Manichaeans, that he could talk to him and ask him these questions. Faustus. Finally, Faustus came. And when he listened to him, he was taken by him, good speaker and everything, and he says, but he figured out that he was shallow. He didn't have the answers he was looking for. Augustine became disenchanted with that whole Manichaean outlook on life. Manichaeanism was sort of a Gnostic type outlook. It had secret knowledge and secret rites in which you would get in touch with these mysteries and so on. So he didn't want to fool with that anymore. And then in 386, that time, remember I told you he went to Milan finally, and there it was that somebody gave him a copy of the books by the Platonists. Again, a lot of people in the room aren't interested in all this, I suppose. A few are. Plotinus, a 3rd century thinker, influenced by Plato. Plotinus had this idea that the great principle was what he called the one, the source of unity. And that source of unity sort of emanated out into this world of ours, and we're the result of that emanation, from the one diffusing itself throughout the world. And as it got more and more diffused, it got less and less goodness in it. So you got down to the material world was really filled with a lot of evil. But that this world kept wanting to get back. The creatures down here wanted to get back united with the one. Well, I mean, to simplify all that, up till that point, Augustine had been almost a complete materialist, like everyone else. He thought the only things that are real is what you can measure and count. And it was at this time in his life that he saw there was something more. There was what he called spirit. Platonic thought had a very spiritual quality to it, and he liked that. And in fact, he liked that whole sequence. Became part of his thinking that God is the one who produces all of this world. It sort of flows from God, and then this whole world down here, like us, what we always want to long for then is to get back. Lord, you've made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. There's sort of a statement of this thing that he got from Plotinus. Also, in this viewpoint, he gave up the idea of the two gods. There was only one God now for him, supreme being, and evil for him now was no longer a result of this evil power working in him, but he came up with this whole idea that evil is a privation of something that should be there, like blindness. Blindness is a lack of sight that human beings ought to have. That's all through our history and the way we've thought about evil up to our own time, a privation of a due good, something that ought to be there. And then in listening to Ambrose, he finally made probably the last step in this part of his intellectual conversion. That is, he took all of that Platonic thought, all that spiritual, high, lofty thinking, and put it into a Christian framework. Now he had the overall view for himself, that God had spoken to us in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was the one who would take us back to the Father. Christ was the mediator between God and us. All language that becomes very familiar to many of us in our training. So that has something to do with this whole idea of the intellectual conversion of Augustine. Let me read you something that he said about this search for truth. He wrote a letter to some former teachers of his. He says, "Let them deal harshly with you who do not know with what labor truth is found." Now, he's had this idea, intellectual conversion takes work. Have to really pursue it with vigor, the search for truth. Again, if we look at our culture, one wonders, where that is. The passionate search for truth, the person who wants to understand and get in touch and know what it's all about. So let's look now at this intellectual conversion and what that would mean. On the one unconverted side, it would mean that we just accept things because some authority told us, because we learn them from our parents or our church or our society. You just walk around with this system on top of one's head, never ingesting it, and just understand the world in those terms without ever really thinking it through. On the other hand, to undergo an intellectual conversion would mean now that one takes responsibility for one's own life. Now one tries to figure out what is true. One is now involved in a search for meaning, for what the world's really about. Now one is willing to wrestle with the great questions. Now one tries to find a way of understanding the world that makes sense to myself, that I can appropriate, that says, yeah, that's how I see the world. So if someone asks me what I believe, my first words aren't, well, the church says, but I would arrive at the point where someone asks me what I believe, I would say, well, I believe this, because I've thought it through, because I've struggled with it, because I've made it my own in one way or another. And in the full intellectual conversion, I would have also gotten to the point where I could talk about it, put into words what it is I see about life, what I hold to be dear, and what I believe to be true, what I've judged to be true about human existence. So, again, the 180, from just going along, drifting, not thinking, brains on hold. Someone asks a question and we're, think me. I remember one of my professors did that when I was in the seminary. I was sitting, how old would I have been? About 23, I suppose. And at the age of 23, I really hadn't yet thought. Seems strange, but I never did. I have great empathy for students who are just groping, who are just beginning, I have great empathy for collegians who have not been thinking. Well, here I was, 23, and a professor asked me a question. Well, I always did well in school because I always memorized the answers. I knew what he had said. Well, he asked me a question, and I didn't know the memorized answer. And I didn't know what to do. I was in a panic. What now? And he said to me, well, think it out. I said, what? Think it out. Well, that would be different. So I got down. Whole class stopped, and I'm thinking. So I figured out, and I told him, I said, well, here's what I came up with. And he said, that's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. Well, that's the last time I thought for a while. Very bad. Good object lesson in what to do if you ask people to think. I mean, he might have said, well, you got a point, or sort of good or something. That's why I'm very cautious with my students. I mean, I have great empathy for people who are trying to think and try and encourage them to do that. But that's a lack of thinking there. But it's possible to go a long time in life without thinking. And but when you start it, it's sort of fun. It really is. It's thinking is a neat thing to do when one becomes converted. Then it's fun to wrestle with the questions and to probe it from different sides and to talk about it. You can tell, to be able to tell other people what you think, and then they say, well, yeah, I think this, and you sort of get involved in the conversation and try to articulate what it is you're thinking. Well, that's what I mean by the intellectual conversion. So I guess we have to ask ourselves here, are we doing any thinking for ourselves? Are there some areas of life that we don't dare think about? Augustine feared that. He was afraid to think a lot of times because of what kind of answers might come up. And that's certainly true. Are we doing any reading, any studying? What are we doing to keep our mind alive? How do we sort of grow old and remain intellectually alert? I mean, that's neat, isn't it, when you see older people who are thinking and interested in life. That's terrific. It seemed like a neat thing to figure out how to do that as one went along in life. so one wasn't dead somehow in his whole life. Well, I think that's the whole intellectual conversion here. I think it would be good at this point for us to take a break, and then let's take 5 minutes, and for those who are still game, come back and we'll talk about imaginative and moral conversions also.